we are up on everyone else and just sort of kick off with what we're here to do today, which is I'm going to give you a kind of overview, both practical and a little bit more about how we learn systemic constellation work and why we might learn systemic constellation work. And what I'm hoping to do is sort of cover enough of the topic for you to feel that you have a sense at least of what it's all about. And obviously the detail comes in the training itself. But I thought I'd begin. I'm going to talk to you for about probably 20-25 minutes. So really do feel free to interrupt by contacting Magda in the chat room, because I'm very happy to be interrupted. And then we'll have questions and comments and anything you feel I've left out that you still want to know. And if there's a core group of you that want to stay on, or there are no questions or whatever, there's also a possibility. I've designed a really tiny online phenomenological exercise which you could do, but it might be that we run out of time for that, or it doesn't feel right. But that's the sort of shape of where we're going to go. And to sort of give you a context about the school itself, the Centre for Systemic Constellations, that we were established in 2000 by a group of first generation UK constellation practitioners. Originally, we arrived as the Hellinger Institute of Britain, and Bert Hellinger gifted us our name back then. And since then, the school itself has had 3 phases and 3 names. You know, the current one, as you know, being Centre for Systemic Constellations. And since 2000, we have been offering a foundation training and a second-year training to an ever-growing community of people from all sorts of personal and professional backgrounds. And initially, as you can imagine, our student base was almost entirely therapists. In fact, right at the beginning, it was almost entirely Gestalt therapists, because the work came through the Gestalt community from Germany back in the early 90s. And then it grew beyond psychotherapy, and the next sort of phase we had, or the next group of students that arrived, were those practicing alternative health, because the 2 methods fit so closely together. They sort of amplify and enhance each other. And then since then, we have trained people from pretty much every professional background. I mean, the ones I like the most, because they're the most unexpected, is we've trained vets, and we've even trained someone in HMRC, which is rather wonderful when you start to think about infiltrating such a sort of hefty institution of this country with systemic ideas. It starts to feel a little bit exciting. But we train people in the creative arts, we train people who are film directors, we train judges, lawyers, people in the NHS consultants. I mean, you name it. The breadth of people who are coming to learn about this work is as never ending as the possible professions we could all do. And I've lost track now, because we're doing more than one foundation a year, but I've lost track slightly of the number of year groups that we've trained. But if you train with us in 2022, 23, you're going to be fitting in as a sort of between 30 and 40th sort of generation of students to come through the school. And we name all this, it sounds a bit of a funny thing to name, but we name it because systemically it's incredibly important and kind of calming to the soul to know where we belong, to know where we fit in, to know whose footsteps we're walking in. It's all very important to this work. So it helps us to orientate in time and space. coming on to and sort of moving swiftly through the practical information that you probably all would like to know. We've got foundation trainings beginning in London and very soon, the 5th of October. And then one next year for you West Country lot in Bristol, which begins at the end of March, on the 29th of March. And we've got our first ever Scottish training that's starting on the 27th of April next year. So we've really tried to become less London-centric as you know, we've grown, very slowly grown. We're still a very piddly small organisation, but we're trying all the time to sort of widen beyond that sense of everyone having to go to London. And each of these trainings, it offers 15 days of learning with a teacher. 12 of them are face-to-face, and those are done in, there are 4 3-day modules. And then in between each of those modules is 1 day on Zoom, which again is teacher-led. We encourage every group to set up a peer practice group, and some of those groups are still meeting 14, 15 years later after their training. And I think it's because the groups that form, people make very deep connections with each other. And I think it's because through all the practice that you do as a learner of this work, you end up stepping into each other's family systems or work systems. And you'll, by the end of the training, will have represented each other's grannies, aunties, parents, grandparents, country of origin. And so the way in which the connections, the relationships in the group evolve, it's very deep and very wide, and people, they tend to stick together. It's a very close community, the Constellation community, I think for all of those reasons. We teach the work through 3 strands of learning, and that makes it quite a dynamic experience. All the teaching that is done in the round or in the circle, much like a Constellation workshop for those of you who've been to a workshop. There's no technology, there's no classroom setting, there's no homework, there's none of that kind of stuff. And included in each of the modules is time for plenty of discussion, and the learning journey has lots of different sort of tempos. And that's partly because of the different nature of the learning journey. The ways in which we need to learn this work is quite broad. And we begin with the first strand of learning, which is theoretical. And here you learn about the field and the system, and you learn about systemic principles, how and why human systems organize themselves in the way they do, and how they attend to balance through a never-ending rhythm of imbalance, how inclusion is vital to each system, because the system itself has an innate knowing around completeness, which is something that underpins the movement of every group of people at a highly unconscious level. You'll also learn theoretically how to run a constellation, and lots of practical information too, but all of the theoretical learning, it often sounds, the word theory sounds dry, but it's not dry in any way when it comes to constellation work. It's sort of incredibly illuminating, sometimes to the extent that there are whole strings of light bulbs that go off as you're learning about this topic and you begin to relate it to your own biography. It sort of makes sense of patterns and sort of issues that reappear down through the generations of your family, and why that's so, and what they're serving. So the second the second strand of learning. First is theoretical, and the second is experiential. And the way we attend to this is we set small exercises in groups and pairs that enable you to develop a somatic sensitivity to what's emerging in the field. This work is about learning how to navigate both the tangible and the intangible space around us. It's about learning to read what's there in the field in a way that we recognize that information in our bodies and can make use of it in terms of determining what interventions to make. So we need to begin to recognize in our bodies what's out of order in the issue that we're working with, the person that we're working with. And we need to make sense of that knowing through our theoretical understanding of the work too. So it's a combination constellation work between understanding how systems flow and flourish and how we pick up that information in highly perceptive and sensitive clues in our bodies. So we literally start to dance with the unseen as well as the seen dynamics that are appearing in front of us. All of our groups are held very safely. We check in with you all the time as learners. And there's a lot of holding and a lot of support because we are going into these unseen places and a lot can emerge as a result of that. But because it's a learning group, and because we're here to develop as practitioners, what we require is that all students are sufficiently psychologically and professionally mature to be able to hold themselves too. And what that means is that when something arises, which it inevitably will, that really touches threads of your own experience, you know, perhaps in a difficult or painful way, what you'll have is you'll be given a tutor and the opportunity to book tutorial sessions, and you take your own personal needs for support and help to your tutorials, but you need to have enough psychological capacity to hold them in the moment, because the curriculum that we have to teach you is enormous, and we can't stop to deal with people's personal development issues at the time, but we do deal with them around within the sort of support network for the group itself. The third thread of learning is practical learning. So from the first day of the course, you'll be invited to set up little tiny constellations in groups of 3 or 4. So you begin to have a sense of what it's like to hold a group, to sense into the field and what's emergent, and to begin to practice your developing systemic understanding. So as you can tell from those 3 strands of learning, you'll be sitting down, standing up, working alone, in pairs, in groups, doing all sorts of different things. It's a dynamic day. So why train now is quite an interesting question. And I've been doing this work for almost 30 years now, and things have changed hugely since I first began. As I said, you know, we started as such a niche little tiny group of people emerging through the Gestalt community, doing something which, when you tried to describe it to your friends, sounded really a step beyond, too mad, too wacky, and certainly not trustworthy as a way of gathering information. You know, when you begin to describe to somebody that I just ask a random stranger in a circle to stand up and represent my grandmother, and this amazing weird thing happens, which is that they suddenly seem to know an awful lot about her, even though I've barely mentioned her, you know, except in passing. You've usually lost people, you know, there's that sort of eyes to heaven look that occurs when you try to describe to people what actually happens in a workshop. But something has been shifting in the 30 years since that was very much the case. And not only is the work growing around the world, and therefore there are more people that are telling their friends to do it, which seems to be the only way that this work spreads, by word of mouth. You know, I'm sure all of you been told by somebody originally to go to a constellation workshop? Yeah. I mean, if you read it on a page, you'd just go, no, not really. Sounds too far out. But so not only are there more people talking about constellation work, but I think also there's something about the wider world that is beginning to catch up with the importance of interconnected thinking. You know, it's a very exciting time to train in this work, because constellation work itself is still, relatively speaking, a very young and evolving movement. And it's still, as a result of that, it's only 30, 35 years old. And so it's still something that's fluid and full of potential. And there's still tremendous space in the field of constellation work for innovation and creativity. There's, you know, fascinating conversations that are had all the time within the community when people share experience of taking this work into different settings. I worked 5 or 6 years ago, I did quite a lot of work in Lebanon at the time that the Syrian civil war had just begun. And I was working with a group of people trying to help. It was a group of those who ran NGOs trying to help the people of Lebanon to step beyond their blind loyalty to the fact that their fathers, grandfathers, uncles, brothers, whatever, had fought in the Lebanese civil wars over time, and the impulse to join the field of their ancestors was so strong that Lebanon itself, let alone the number of refugees that were flooding across the border, was in a very, very unstable time. And that was obviously before all the other things that happened to Lebanon. But, you know, we're still at a stage in the evolution of this work where we're taking work in its sort of most precious and potent form into all sorts of new areas and seeing what it can offer and what it can deliver to widen our understanding of what's going on. And within that, there's a kind of sense that the work is coming of age. We're almost at a tipping point. I think we might just be there, where the world around us is beginning to recognize the importance of interconnected thinking. And although we know on some level that we're all connected, it is almost as if collectively human beings can no longer pretend that we're separate. We can't pretend that we're separate from the earth, from Mother Nature. But also, socially and politically, we are beginning to recognize that we can't separate social care policies from health policies, or health from agriculture, or agriculture from the environment, or the environment from climate change, or climate change from us. You know, each of these circles is now in full view, and our collective survival is dependent on us beginning to recognize that departmentalized and siloed ways of attending to things that need our attention is no longer giving the kind of solutions that are lasting and meaningful for humanity. And in the same way, when we're working with individuals and groups, what we see is that a change for one member of a family or for one person within the workplace will impact everyone else in that system too. So I was working last year with a husband of and father of young children who had a spectacularly difficult breakdown, and the crisis team around him who were trying to support him only had resources for his needs, but actually every intervention they made that was in service of his recovery was impacting on his partner and young children too. And so the solutions that were being offered were only partial solutions. They weren't solutions that were really bringing that family system back into balance. So what constellation work does is it enables us to navigate the world around us in a whole system way. It enables us to develop what we call a systemic lens. So we literally begin to see the world and relationships in a very different way. You know, we don't see individual to individual, but you begin to talk to your friends once you've done the course. And then as they're explaining something to you about what they're sitting with that's difficult, you find yourself asking things like, and where did your grandmother come from? And what happened in, you know, what happened in the generation before you? And, you know, this sort of thing, you begin to see everything from the perspective of its relationship to everything else. And people and families are no different in this way. So the image that supports us with this way of understanding the world and issues around us is the image of the baby mobile, where when you move one element, all the other elements move too. And what we're doing is we are looking for, this is currently my own favorite description of what this work does. If someone asks me, and I've got a sentence to describe it, what we look for in constellation work is this story that's big enough to make a difference. So we look for the story where that everything that needs to be seen and included and attended to is present, so that the whole system comes back into balance. And of course, when we talk about systems, which is a pretty ghastly word, really, we're talking about body systems, we're talking about human systems, family systems, relationships, organizational systems, and we're also talking about environmental systems too, because the principles that you learn in this training, the systemic principles, are applicable to all these different systems. They all operate, systemic principles operate in exactly the same way in whatever system you're working in. So you begin to see why it's an exciting time and why so many people are innovating with this work and taking it into new professional settings, because the principles which are observed, they're natural laws that underpin the movement of life. They weren't invented by Bert Hellinger or Hunter Beaumont, or it's not an idea. What they are is observed principles that emerge phenomenologically. They emerge through observation, and they've been noted and seen. It's a sort of ancient knowing in some ways that have been observed in philosophy, and it's now in quantum science too, that these same principles, these governing forces, if you like, emerge in every single walk of life.